Greetings, my name is Michael Miller. This is a Michael Miller trademark training video out to you because you're watching. Thank you and welcome. It's meant for Michael Miller Pilates licensed affiliates, the Core New Core, my patrons, and anyone interested in surviving and thriving as a Pilates instructor or student. Mondays are a lot to digest days because Saturday happens and Sunday happens and Monday happens, and all those notes then try to come into some synthesis of presentation. So number one is CT and MMP. That's because that's the title of an email that went out to my email list today. And if you're not on that email list and you want to see the emails that are going to come out every day until the 21st, which is the MMPC, Michael Miller Pilates Convention, which is an observance of solstice. So go to hermit.com and get on the mailing list if you want to be there. And then I got an email from someone that said, get me off of your list, or get me off of this list. And so I, on that very email, clicked on unsubscribe and unsubscribed and was happy to do it for them. I didn't recognize the name, and when I looked to see what the name was connected to, it was to a large franchised interest in Pilates. So, in a way, no surprise there. But CT and MMP, to me, I'm amazed that so much of my focus has just come down to wanting you to know those two things. Be aware of core new tension and be aware of Michael Miller Pilates as one point of view out of many, thousands, millions. But even regardless, if you already have your own point of view of Pilates, and whatever I might say is heresy to that point of view, don't dismiss core new tension, because that's biomechanics in the body. And your awareness of that can influence your instructing as a Pilates instructor. Right. But see, that brings me to number two. And number two are titles that were in my last broadcast. I think it was my last one. And I had all these views, and I'm wondering if these two titles were some of the draw to why so many views happened. Because the titles are Bastardized Pilates and Faux Pilates. And faux has been sort of my sense of what I see out there in the Pilates world. And yet when someone comes out and says to me bastardized, like what they're seeing is a bastardized version of Pilates, that leaves them at times unfulfilled. So, if this is the first time you're listening to that conversation, bastardized, if you look up on Google, that's how I do it, but is a version of something. And then it goes on, lower in quality or value than the original form. So bastardized assumes it is something, some version of something. These are Google's words, and we're talking about a version of Pilates, lower in quality or of value than the original form. Okay? So there's that key thing, that there's an original form. And then faux Pilates made to look like something else that is usually more valuable. Something faux is made to look like something else that is usually more valuable. Think watches and luggage. There's all kinds of things. Faux. But see, faux is a French word for fake. But it is a very chic word for fake. And here's where I think we're getting into some interesting discernment when we're talking about words and Pilates and bastardized and faux Pilates. And yet, see, one, bastardized to me has such a negative, illicit, illegitimate connotation to it. That's just me and my smear of whatever that word means to me. Whereas faux Pilates is a fancy word for fake, and as a fancy fake, it's chic, and chic by definition is going by elegantly and stylishly fashionable. So whereas bastardized Pilates can be a version of something lower in quality or value than the original form, faux Pilates is something made to look like something else that is usually more valuable. So see, in both cases, in bastardized and faux, there is something else that is being offered or presented. Right? Whatever it is based on something else. There's a good way of saying it. So, and I think there's a lot of hits on that last broadcast of mine, because it comes close to heart in our feelings about Pilates and what we might consider to be bastardized Pilates or faux Pilates, and discerning what that means to us, to empower us to be a more effective Pilates instructor. Okay? And so, I think Pilates has always been chic. Well, see, alright, so how do I present this in a logical fashion? Whether it's bastardized or faux, both cases refer to something else. And what makes it so convenient for those who would make it faux Pilates and be expressing themselves stylistically or elegantly, right, as fashion, as a fashion statement, is because this something else that the faux is based on. I mean, how do you discern between faux and the something else that is usually more valuable? This is a fascinating discussion for me, and I hope for you, in terms of who are you as a Pilates instructor, and how do you discern bastardized Pilates and faux Pilates from whatever it is you consider to be the real thing. And see, that's where it gets vague, because all we have of Pilates is a heritage of folklore and hearsay, and some precious original work from Joe himself, his pictures, his words, and his film. Okay. And yet so far the discernment between bastardized and faux has been sort of a self-indulgent argument within the court of Pilates. Because by looking at it through tradition and lineage and presumed aristocratic authority, to say what it was without any explanation or relation to what is there already in Joe's original work, see, that's the deal. Okay, so it's 2019, and since forever, the point of view is intriguing, but it's threatening. I'm talking about the MMP point of view of Pilates, because it takes away from everybody being able to make of it whatever they want. And so in that regard, all of Pilates, the word Pilates, starts out bastardized, as does faux, F-A-U-X. To survive as a Pilates instructor, what matters is, I think, in my opinion, your ability to instruct toward that which both of those are based on. Now, how do you do that, see? How do you do that? If the only authority is a presumed one, that has little or nothing to, well, I shouldn't say it that way. It's connected to the original work, but it makes no explanation of the original work. So, the knife cuts both ways. It's catch-22. It's very bad news to hear that Pilates has an essence of its own when everybody has enjoyed, historically, making of it whatever they wish. But if for no other reason, the presence of the profit motive will explore what makes it what it is in order to maximize profit, without necessarily selling what it is to do the maximization. But they'll want to understand. So that's where my number, well, I have, number 3 is a question, and I'm not sure I have any elaboration on it. To what extent are we wearing and selling the emperor's clothes? And that's why I said we in there. To what extent are we selling and wearing the emperor's clothes? Because if it's all made up about Pilates, and it's all subjective, and only to be absorbed by some other point of view, if the thing behind faux Pilates, if the thing that bastardized is coming from is only based on subjective, whimsical, tides within the court of Pilates, then everyone is is in that lovely place of it all being about them and who they are within the tapestry, and not paying any attention to or allowing an explanation of Pilates to intrude or interfere with what they've already got going. But there's the deal, see? Okay, so how to handle the tsunami of Pilates passion where droves of students come in to participate in movement and how can that appear to be so bastardized or such a faux version merely compared to what you know of Pilates and how you've taught and teach Pilates? How do you deal with the intrusion of monetization? Well, and that's where I get to number 4. See, the bad news is MMP makes an explanation of Pilates. And that robs you of the freedom to make of it whatever you want. The good news is that MMP explains Pilates. And in explaining it, reveals the foundation of Pilates. It won't change anything about the Pilates culture and the Pilates court and aristocracy and all of that, other than there'll be an explanation that points to an ideal that you can feel. And that's where the MMP comes in as cavalry, because I think it does the best job so far out there of what is Pilates versus what is bastardized or faux Pilates. And faux Pilates can be and is very popular, stylized and fashionable, right? But if you're interested, for me, to survive as a Pilates instructor, you really want to know what it's about and what your role is and what you're aiming for. And with the MMP, you're aiming for an experience. You could say that, right? As much as I wasn't... Could you say it's not faux Pilates and it's not bastardized Pilates if the experience is there? That's a good question. Because if contrology is complete coordination of body, mind, and spirit, within MMP that's considered to be a state of being in the body, in the moment of the doing, and it happens in the now. Can you be in the, see, I think you can be in that state of being in the body anytime you're coordinated in your being, thinking, and observing. The doing of Pilates is the doing of the choreography, the movement of the human being in space, all of it that's going on there. So the experience of being completely coordinated in your being, thinking, and observing, I think is there to be had in any number of ways, many of them thrill-seeking in a way because it draws you into the moment so much. But it doesn't have to be that way. MMP is the Calvary because it makes sense of Pilates. Intellectually, it explains Pilates for the essence within itself, where there's a discernment between bastardized and faux, between the real thing. And so those are sensitive words, and with Pilates, it's very easy to take on an attitude that what you got is the real thing, and what you see out there is bastardized. MMP is bastardized because the real thing is just Joe's books, Joe's words, and Joe's pictures. And then the tradition that follows from those that knew him and worked with him. MMP is transcendent because it goes beyond that as a source of legitimacy by making an explanation of Pilates under a theory that there's an ideal within the original work that you can feel, which is the complete coordination of body, mind, and spirit as a state of being in the body in the moment of the doing. Use my words, polish them, own them for yourself to make the explanation. Because sometimes, for me, the words become redundant when they're the best ones I've got, and I haven't figured out a way to say it better yet. And so MMP is the Calvary because it not only makes sense sensationally, it also makes sense intellectually, and it's completely based on Joe's words. It's an interpretation of Joe's words, and that's what makes MMP a bastardization, because it's a version of Joe's words. Now, when you get off and see, I think bastardized is a harsher term, and I put it out of order because why? See, I used it, wrote it down, and then lost the paper. Whereas faux is obviously fake, but it's chic fake. It's French fake. And that's enough to roll your eyes back in your head when you're talking about Pilates and movement and what it's about. First of all, there's not much conversation in 2019 about what makes it what it is, because historically it's been about who you are aristocratically within the culture. But big money is sweeping in, and when it comes to surviving as a Pilates instructor, in my opinion, from my point of view, and therefore the MMP point of view about Pilates and what it is and how to survive, it looks at Pilates in a way that big money won't be able to look at it for a very long time. Won't be inclined to look at it for a very long time. So, to the extent that you're listening to me and you're aware of CT and MMP, appreciate the high ground you occupy, and that not many people will seek out what you know, other than to have a lesson from you and to get what they expect without even maybe noticing the addition to what you bring as an instructor by seeking complete coordination of being, thinking, and observing, that in some points of view have no place because of whatever reason. You know, whether it's wanting to maintain a tradition in the tradition, and to me that's maintaining true to historical reenactment, and that whatever you get out of the original thing only comes from what you reenact historically. I say take as many points of view as you can about Pilates to assemble your own, and to the point that you have been introduced to a point of view that is ideal in nature, it comes to the rescue like cavalry, because it gives you a reason for the cue that comes out of your mouth, or your tactile, or the next exercise you pick, or how you make an explanation beyond being a presenter. Seen as a threat, this point of view, MMP, because it makes an explanation, it is, and yet, if there are trade-offs that can make it also seem like the cavalry, depending upon how swallowed up you are in the tsunami of Pilates passion, and how much of a group mentality you're choosing to establish in order to maintain the integrity of the in here that you've got for you, versus all of the other that's out there that of course is bastardized and faux. Alright, so a new insight for me. Oh, this is very practical in one sense. And then I'm almost out of here. This is my last title. It's called A New Insight for Me. So I've talked about the Volkswagen and the Ferrari because I saw on social media someone demonstrate a position on the reformer, the Pilates reformer, and call it the high bridge. And if you were to put the top of your head on the floor, or on the carriage, on the reformer, and then cup your head and have your forearms on the reformer as well, so you had that platform of head and hands and elbows anchored all, and then in a extended position put your feet on the foot bar, so you're in an extension anchored at the head and the forearms and the elbows. Okay? And that's the high bridge. And so the high bridge, as I know it, is hands on the shoulder rests, longer arms, not necessarily locked straight, but longer arms, and the whole body's in this big arch. And if you put one leg up, the leg goes vertical. You're demonstrating capacity to match or reflect the physics in which you live. And so when I responded, so that was my view, and are they both, what do you call my view of it? Well, they're both the high bridge. So instead of a rose is a rose by any other name, a rose is a rose, and it's also a daisy. And maybe that doesn't really apply, because you could argue that the different expressions of this position in space are variations, yes, but to me one isn't necessarily the other. So in what regard is it a bastardized version of the high bridge? If it's just a variation that is not as difficult, or it would be more difficult maybe, but it's the variation. See, what is it? And is when you show something and call it the thing, see, is that really the high bridge? Well, not to me. It's not the high bridge. It's a variation of the high bridge, so it's faux high bridge. It's bastardized high bridge. To me, what makes it what it is the documentation in Joe's pictures and video and words. So the insight for me, because I've seen, it's this body position of head and arms, you know, like where you would go if you wanted to do a headstand, especially if you were in the movement modality of doing a headstand in yoga. And that was a new insight for me, is that some of the things I see in social media, where the head is down and the arms are around, and there's this platform from which something else is happening. Like I saw it again on the low chair. The head in contact, forearms, elbows, and in that platform, from the low chair, come up into headstand, and then come down into back on the pedal. It's a good try. It can get better, but there was that position again. And I'm pointing it out to you, and to me, maybe it's a premature or completely off assumption, but having done a little bit of yoga, not a lot, and not being an authority in it at all, maybe it's in some other modality of movement that people are coming into Pilates and expressing themselves on Pilates equipment from that anchorage, but it seems yoga-esque to me, and there's no judgment in that other than a recognition of where it's coming from, and whether or not, as such, whether or not it's part of the original thing or been bastardized and turned into a faux thing for the sake of fashion. So that was a new incitement for me. Okay, so my takeaway on this, gosh, if you're listening to this and it's making any sense to you at all, my takeaway is that you can do this. What is it? What do I mean by this? And I think for me, where I'm coming from in this broadcast is that you can grasp you can get what I'm talking about. You can get that I'm identifying two things. I'm pointing to core new tension and saying that's biomechanical. And you can ignore it if you want, but I don't know why you would, because it gives you two things. It gives you a sensation of alignment, and it takes you toward more uniform engagement of your musculature, thereby making you lighter in space, thereby developing the body more uniform, developing the body uniformly. You can do this. And so the pulling the sword out of the stone is recognizing the sword and how it cuts and what it's made of. And coordinated tension is just a point of view by a Pilates instructor about how the body engages itself to move through space. You don't need to explain it any more than that to know that it works and it's perceptible and it influences how well the body controls itself when it moves through space. See, don't listen to me if you're interested in historical reenactment. Don't listen if you're a member of a group that only wants to preserve and develop and profit from their way of looking at it. The great thing about Pilates, it is a gift from one human being to humanity, individually. So from one human being to every human being. To this day, my day, 2019, I don't really think that the amount of acclaim and recognition coming Joseph Pilates' way has even begun. So, a new insight to me. Oh, you can do this. What can you do? Well, my dismay is hearing about others' dismay at what's happening in their Pilates experience that's sometimes being unfulfilling. And a biased point of view is that the fulfilling for me comes in seeking to help coordinate being, thinking, and observing, and reaching for an ideal you can feel. That's a very narrow point of view for what Pilates is. It's ideal in nature. It's not like anything else. It comes from three things from Joe directly. And the bonus is understanding biomechanics that no one else wants to really acknowledge or absorb the implications. What do I mean by that? That an old picture of Joseph Pilates in teaser sitting on the barrel has an endpoint of tension at the metatarsals. He's in a demi-point. He's got baggy pants, so you really can't evaluate the engagement of the knees, but he definitely has an endpoint of tension at the metatarsals. In a Pilates exercise that he's being photographed in as a photo op. There were other pictures, okay? Gray hair, silver, old Joe. Versus Joe's book, locked knees and pointed toes. So, like we were talking about this coming from yoga, perhaps locked knees and pointed toes coming from the commingling of cultures between Pilates and dance. But those cultures separate, see, with Pilates in the MMP point of view, because you're looking at the choreography and respecting its reaction to reality. The nature of its reaction to reality. So MMP sort of implicitly acknowledges the biomechanics of core new tension. And so there's this huge leap from where the norm is to where there's a different point of view. And that point of view can be had for an explanation of going from down here up a gondola ride to look around, which is the explanation. And perhaps in the explanation, there is a way for you to better discern real Pilates from faux Pilates. Real Pilates from bastardized Pilates. So remember, in both of those cases, they're referring to something else of higher value that then is taken to offer as something else. The trouble with Pilates is that in the tradition there is nothing tangible to grab onto that helps you make a discernment between the real thing and imitation. And that's going to work for a long time, for a while, but I don't predict it very long because a whole lot of thinking is moving in. And that means a whole lot of evaluation on what makes it the real thing versus faux or bastardized. The sooner you know, the better. To help you survive as a Pilates instructor, because you're connected to an understanding So I don't see how you participate in Big Money's presentation of the work or what they offer for money, because I don't know that it can be fulfilling by the nature of what drives it and what it is, at least for a generation or two, maybe 1,000 years. So you can do this. I mean, you can use CT and MMP as understandings of your own, and as such, find the fulfillment of helping students coordinate their being, thinking, and observing. And if that doesn't set you out from what Pilates is being presented as, by and large, see, you're not just a Pilates instructor, you're an ideal Pilates instructor. You're not just a Pilates instructor, but you know about biomechanics that isn't in the books yet. Now, maybe that's all an illusion and a delusion of mine. I understand that, but I'm doing my best job to offer you this point of view and to recognize how much authority it gives you and how much transcendence it gives you, because you at least can explain it. And for as much as it's inconvenient for whatever it is you're doing to have an explanation, we're already well down the pike of it being explained, and of what could all be called bastardized and faux continue to be presented as real, because it's as real as anything else out there. So keep in mind, as a Pilates instructor, it's you, the human being, and in some way interacting with a student or students, either as a presenter, a teacher, or an instructor. You want to feel the feeling of excited or fulfilled. Introduce somebody to Pilates in a way that gives them something beyond what they're accustomed to experiencing. That's how you end up adding 2 and 2. That's how you create a range of tiers beyond what you think anyone might want to support you at. But those that have the capability of doing that will embrace the karma of that, and also puts you to task to see what you do with such beneficence. If you miss the old style Pilates court, if you miss a gender-dominated presumption of authority about essence, all of that will continue to be in the culture for generations. But if you're really looking for the gravity of the situation, it's the fact that Pilates doesn't understand itself, and in its effort to do that, will end up in the ideal. At least that's how I look at it. And I hope I've shared it with you well, because life can't live forever. Read between the lines and see behind the curtain. Evaluate perspectives. Hello. Then add 2 and 2 for negotiating for what you're offering to do as a presentation, or as a teacher, or as an instructor. Direct your thinking. Geist.